Hey everyone, this is Andy Hall. With me today is Jason Foux, and if we have time, we have a really funny story, or Jason has a really funny story about how he got that last name. Jason, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm caffeinated and I'm partially hydrated, so we're off to a good start, I guess.
Double
And
plus
and I'm
good.
awake. I'm mostly vertical, so
Uh, Mostly. Excellent, sir.
mostly. I have a chair supporting me, so it doesn't count all the way.
So, for people who aren't acquainted with you or your podcast, Dragons in Genesis, you want to just give them a summary?
Yeah, so I have a podcast called Dragons in Genesis, and the easiest way to find it is to go to any podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spreaker, anything like that, and just search Dragons in Genesis, and you'll see a big orange logo with a silhouette of Godzilla attacking Jerusalem. You can't miss it. And as I tell people, it is the number one secular Bible study podcast with Godzilla on the logo. Um, I figure if you add enough qualifiers, I'll be number one by default, and that's the best way to win. So that the podcast is basically a secular Bible study comparative mythology podcast. And what I do is I go through the Bible and like starting with Genesis chapter 1 and just going through. And I touch on all of these different Bible stories, what they mean within the context of the Bible, within the context of that particular book, the historic context, and of course, the mythological context. Like, what other Near Eastern stories that were around at the time could have influenced this or inspired this story? Or how does it relate to these other stories? How well does it fit in to popular myths that were around at the time?
Mhm.
And I don't skip anything. Like, I cover every single chapter. So I don't go from Noah's Ark to the Tower of Babel because there's like a whole chapter in between there that no one ever talks about of all this, begats. And there's actually a little bit of interesting stuff in there. Not too much that's interesting. That's a boring part. But I don't skip that part. It's all there. And so anything I touch on, I do it in its entirety. Um, and so the podcast, as far as the Bible is concerned, has gone from the first chapter of Genesis to the last chapter of Second Samuel. But occasionally I take little detours because I get bored with, the Bible, and I'll jump off into something else. Like last year, I did this, I think, 5-part series about this transition in theology that occurred around the time of the Babylonian exile. And this year, I took what was supposed to be a slight detour, but has lasted most of the year, to talk about Enoch,
Yeah.
which is absolutely bonkers. And that's a technical term. You can look it up. Bonkers. It means not biblically, I don't know, something. It's bonkers. Okay.
It's not orthodox, to say the least.
Right. That's the word I'm looking for. The caffeine hasn't kicked in just yet, but I'm working on it.
Sure. So yeah, I binged through your episodes about Enoch, and I thought, oh, I have to get this guy on my channel so I can learn more and maybe get into a deeper dive for listeners too and viewers. So who was Enoch, dude? Who was he?
So Enoch pops up basically one time in the Bible, and he's barely mentioned. Okay, and what it is in the genealogy going from Seth to Noah. So you have this real fun story where Cain hits his brother Abel over the head with a rock, and you think, oh man, we're finally getting some excitement in this Bible. And then it's like, okay, so he went off to be alone, yet started a whole city, and then he had another brother named Seth. And then it goes into this whole big chapter of begats. Seth begat so and so, begat so and so, begat so and so. And a little bit before it gets to Noah, it says that there was a guy named Enoch. And each person in this little genealogy, they live like incredible lengths of time, like 800, 900 years, stuff like that. And for that section, Enoch has an incredibly short lifespan, 365 years. But what's really weird is that for all these other people, it says that they died. They lived so many hundreds of years. Then they gave birth to so and so, and then at the age of 800 years, they died. With Enoch, it says he lived 365 years, and then he went up and walked with God. Doesn't say he died. It said he walked with God. He went up. He ascended. And it's like, okay, that's weird. And then the story moves on, and it doesn't tell us why this dude just walked off into heaven, how he ascended. It doesn't say anything special about him. And then he has a son, Lamech, and then Methuselah, and then Noah. Okay, and those are his descendants. And it just kind of leaves us. But around this same time, right before we get to the story of Noah in Genesis 6, 1-3, it tells us that around this time, some angels, some sons of God, sons of El, came down to earth, and they had sex with human women, and it created a race of giants called the Nephilim. And God realized that this was bad and had to purge the earth, and so he's going to send the flood. And then we move on to the story of Noah. He builds this ark, and it doesn't say anything about these giants or the sons of God or Enoch in that entire story. So it looks like something's missing. Like there's a reference to it, and scholars had been pointing this out for centuries, that these passages look weird. They are referencing something that no longer exists. And so Enoch is this weird legendary character in Jewish mythology that sort of fell out of the Bible. And the Old Testament doesn't really have much about him other than this one little passage about how he lived 365 years. Yes, there's a connection to the days of the year in there. And then he went up into heaven and wasn't on the earth anymore. And that's basically it. That's all we know until 1769, when a guy named James Bruce from Scotland went to Ethiopia in search of the headwaters of the Nile. And it was almost like a clickbait article. What he found next will blow your mind. Between northern Egypt and Ethiopia, there are no Christians. So you've got 1,000 miles of Africa with all kinds of different religions there, and no trace of Christianity in between. And he goes in there, and the place is littered with Christians. They have temples, they have churches, they have Bibles. And their Bibles are different. They have a lot of the same books, but then they have books that he had never heard of. No one had ever heard of before. And one of these books was this fascinating thing called the Book of Enoch. And it was thrown right there in the middle of their Old Testament. And it starts filling gaps in the story. Like, why did Enoch go up into heaven? Why did he live 365 years? What happened with the Nephilim, these giants, the sons of God, all this stuff, And all of a sudden, people are going nuts because the entire view of the Bible begins to shift, because we suddenly start to get a clearer picture of the mythology that was no longer in the Old Testament. And so that's sort of who Enoch was.
Right. So what is the structure? Because like many books of the Bible, there are different sections within the Book of Enoch. Broadly speaking, what are the sections? What are the individual sections of the Book of Enoch?
So Enoch is made of 5 sections. The first one is called the Book of Watchers. And the Watchers are your fallen angels. Though that might not be a good description, because they don't necessarily fall from heaven. There are actually multiple traditions in there about how they got to earth. They're all kind of mixed together. The the editors tried to merge it all into one story, but you can tease it apart. And there's actually multiple stories about how they got to Earth. And in two of those stories, the story of Semyaza and the story of Azazel, they come to Earth willingly. They come down here of their own accord. So they're not fallen. They are just sort of descended angels. And in whatever tradition you look at in this section, they basically are responsible for bringing corruption to the perfect creation of Earth. And that's the first book, the Book of Watchers. And that's the one everyone pays attention to because it's really exciting. It's got mile-high giants and angel sex and all kind of craziness. Then there's the second book. This is called the Book of Parables, or the Parables of Enoch. The Parables of Enoch is divided into 3 sections, and it's 3 different visions that Enoch has, though they seem to actually be 3 versions of the same story. But if you're familiar with the Bible, you know that if you have multiple versions of one story, you just put them all in there.
Right.
And this section is really weird, and it's highly controversial because of what it talks about. Anyone familiar with Christianity knows that Son of Man is a title for Jesus, unless you read the Book of Enoch. The term Son of Man is all over this section, the Parables of Enoch. And at the end of it, and I believe the second to last chapter of that section, it tells you who the Son of Man is. And it also tells some interesting things about the Son of Man. And that has both inspired some Christians and also angered some. And it's one of the reasons why some Christians point to the Book of Enoch and say, this is proof that Jesus, was foretold by prophecy. And others point to it and say, Enoch is fake. It's forged. The whole thing is bogus. It's, so it's a really fascinating section.
Sure.
Then you get to the third section, which most people think is the most boring, and it's called the Book of Astronomy.
And I just want to stop you there for a second. When I was listening to your podcast, you wonderfully put this particular section of the Book of Enoch really made a big impression on me, and it really is the crux of the entire book.
Yeah, thank you. That warms my heart because...
And not only is it a crux of the entire book, but it also explains a lot about the divisions within Judaism, which we will talk about. Mm-hmm. But I just want to say, job well done talking about this astronomy book.
Thank you so much, because I put so much into that episode, more than maybe any other episode I have done since I started the podcast like 5 years ago. Yeah. And I was so worried that it wouldn't work.
No, I think it worked. I think it worked wonderfully. I don't know if anyone else has told you that, but it really made a big impression on me.
Yeah, I've actually built on the stuff that I did in there even more. And I have new stuff that will eventually come out concerning that because I've actually learned even more than I knew a few months ago when I put that episode together. But it's weird because the Book of Astronomy is the section of Enoch. It's the middle of the book. So it's 5 sections. The Book of Astronomy is the third section. So it's the dead center of the book. And it's the part everyone ignores because it seems boring. It explains like their cosmology, the earth is flat. It's under a big glass dome, and it talks about the movements of the stars and all the different winds and what they bring and, where rain is stored and how all this stuff works and all the rest. And it's like, okay, this gives you an idea of their worldview, but what does this have to do with theology? And so everyone basically ignores the center of the Book of Enoch and they move on. And the Book of Astronomy gets no scholarly attention. And they move on to Book 4 and Book 5. And when reading it, I thought, this is a mistake. There's a problem because of stuff that happened in chapters 1 through 6 of the Book of watchers. It seems to be talking about things in the book of astronomy. And it's like, this isn't something that just got crammed in there. This is important. And I didn't know how it was important at first, but eventually things kind of started to fit together. And it's like, this may actually be the most important section of Enoch, and it's the thing no one touches. And that's why I wanted to go so in depth on that one short book that just talks about essentially a calendar, because I think it is not only important, but may actually be the most important part of this entire book. And I think the text itself, which is what I do in the second half of that episode, is try to explain why I think the text itself is telling us that the astronomy book is so important, because I think the calendar and how it gets corrupted after the Babylonian exile basically messed with their entire theology.
Let's
And
talk
I
about
think
the
a lot of
divisions
these are symbolic of that.
Right. After we're done talking about the structure, about the different books in the Book of Enoch, I really want to dive into the divisions of Judaism and the Book of Astronomy. But the next book is what? The Book of Dreams?
Yeah, the Book of Dreams, or the Dreams of Enoch. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. Enoch receives, I believe, 2 dreams. One's really long, one's really short. And essentially he like goes into a trance, which is basically all of Enoch. He goes into a trance, there's some kind of visions, and then he writes them down, or he tells them to somebody. And one of these is about the Great Flood. And it's a slightly different flood story than what we have in Genesis 7. A lot of the details are the same, but there are some differences. And I go through those differences in the episode. Episode 53, I believe. And it's familiar, but there are some key differences that are or may be important. They're at least important to the people who preserved the Book of Enoch. And there's this other vision. This is a longer one. And it's one of the most fun in the entire book. And the whole Book of Enoch is a blast. And it's called The Animal Apocalypse. I mean,
that was hilarious.
That's a heavy metal album, if ever there was one. That is awesome.
Right.
It's
and
called
what
The
does
Animal.
the word apocalypse mean in this context?
So apocalypse, it basically means something that is revealed to you. So that there's something that's hidden, and then it kind of gets revealed. It gets shown to you. Okay. And so like apocalyptic literature doesn't necessarily mean like the end of the world, but often it is, because in apocalyptic literature, a lot of times the thing that gets revealed to you are visions of the end of the world. And this is a type of literature that was made popular after the Jews became exposed to the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which is our oldest surviving monotheistic religion in the world. They were monotheist before Judaism was. It's almost certainly a direct influence of their theology that caused the Jews to dismiss like 70 of their deities and then take their 2 favorites and just merge them into one God and say, okay, we are monotheistic. It's where the great cosmic evil of Satan came from. It's where the whole messianic movement came from. Apocalyptic literature, eschatology, the end of the world, the idea of good people going up to an eternal paradise. Actually, the word paradise is a Persian word. It comes from their cosmology. The idea that sinners are punished, the idea that gods are concerned with human morality and you will be judged for that in the afterlife. Before that, people all went to the same afterlife, Sheol or whatever. And it was just sort of this dim, dark version of Earth.
Yeah.
Good, bad, didn't matter. You all went to the same place. And here, no. If you do good, you are rewarded in this blissful paradise. If you do bad, you are cast into fire. The idea of a fiery afterlife, Zoroastrianism.
Mhm.
About 70% of rabbinic Judaism comes from Persia. They had an even larger impact on Christianity and an equally large impact on Islam. If you know of a monotheistic religion today, it is almost certainly directly or indirectly affected by Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
But there's this, back to the Enoch, there's this thing called the animal apocalypse. And what it is, they retell the story of the whole history of the world, beginning with Adam and Eve and ending with like the end of the world. But all of the players are replaced with animals.
With animals. It's like
Yes,
this.
yeah, I'm not. It's literal. Like, oh, there's this white bull, and he came up out of the earth, and he goes and does this. Oh, okay. Well, that's this.
It's like the Cartoon Network version of it.
Right. So Pixar wrote part of the Book of Enoch, and there's all these different things. And what's really cool, and this is another fun little thing that you'll only get if you're familiar with Zoroastrianism, is a sort of origin to our kosher food laws. So in the animal apocalypse, there's this fun little section where it talks about sort of bad people, because everyone is replaced with animals, right? You see a lamb. Oh, well, that's a good person. You see a boar. That's an evil person. Well, it says that some of these angels came down and they had sex with like horses and asses and all kind of stuff like that, and cows and everything else, and it created all these weird things like camels and elephants and stuff. And it's like, okay, that's weird. There's this neat little thing in Zoroastrianism, and it says that Ahriman HaSatan, which is their big bad evil guy,
Yep.
he saw all the animals that Ahura Mazda, the good god, had created, and he decided to mess with it. And so what he did was he goes in and he creates his own animals that are very similar. But with each one, there's like one thing that's off. And so instead of creating like a cow that has, cloven hooves and 4 legs and eats grass, he creates a pig. It has cloven hooves and 4 legs, but it doesn't chew cud. And so it's not a good, pure animal that Ahura Mazda created. It's an evil corruption created.
Are you telling me that pigs are orcs? Because I think about orcs in Middle Earth, and they're corrupted elves. So pigs are corrupted animals.
Yeah. So according to Zoroastrianism, the impure animals, the animals they saw as being impure, they were impure because they didn't fit into this crude taxonomy that they had created. And their explanation for that, the reason they were slightly off, was that they were corruptions made by the great evil spirit of Ahriman, which would later become our Satan. Ahriman HaSatan means Ahriman the opposer. Right. Opposer in Hebrew is Satan. And so we end up with this idea after the Babylonian exile. We don't really have any evidence of this in the pre-Babylonian period. We end up with this idea that the Israelites, they reject things like lobsters and lizards and rabbits and pigs. And it doesn't say that the meat will get you sick. That's not what the text says. Go back and read the book of Leviticus. It does not say anything about sickness. It says nothing about food poisoning. People knew how to cook pigs. They used to cook pigs. We have the archaeological evidence. We have pig bones in some of their low elevation cities. Okay. They used to breed them and keep them and eat them. The Egyptians had been eating pigs for thousands of years. Right. People knew how to cook pork. Okay. It says nothing about that. It says the reason you don't eat those animals is because they are impure. They are abominations. they don't fit the taxonomy. It says, oh, if it has cloven hooves and 4 legs, but it doesn't chew cud, it is an improper animal. It is impure. This is Zoroastrianism.
Right.
And we get a hint of this in Enoch. It basically, it's telling us, because people are animals in all over Enoch, things have multiple meanings. Okay. And that's common with all apocalyptic literature. But Enoch tells us that evil angels, some of the sons of God that came down and corrupted the world, created these animals. And the animals it created by having sex with pure animals and creating these bastard offspring are all non-kosher animals. And so they're meant to represent impure animals that were the creations of Ahriman, but they're also meant to represent people who did not follow the correct theology, the enemies of righteousness, the enemies of the elect ones. So they're impure animals, and they are also impure people.
I'm going to make a really bad pun right now, because the last book of Enoch, the epistles, strikes me as a book of beef, as in a book of, I have some problems with you people, and I'm going to tell you what it is, in terms of very kind of sectarian, kind of like, you don't agree with it, you don't agree with me, so now you're going to all go to the bad place.
Yeah. And Enoch loves the sectarian division. That is evident throughout all 5 books. And there's one other thing that I want to touch on real quick in the animal apocalypse. So not only does it retell the entire history of the world, with everyone recast as animals, which is just fantastic, and has the coolest name of any religious text, but there's this really curious passage in there that talks about this one ram that shows up when all the sheep Jews are being oppressed, and he gathers a bunch of sheep to him, and he kind of fights against them and all this other stuff. And for centuries, like ever since they found this book, people have pointed to that and said, this is a prophecy about Jesus. Everyone's like, prophecy about Jesus. Completely ignoring the fact that half the stuff it says about him doesn't make sense. Like, he takes a sword from his enemies and uses it against them, and he's leading this battle with this sword. When did Jesus have a sword? Exactly. And they're like, oh, well, the sword is his faith. Well, yeah, if you change enough words, if you just erase stuff and make it mean something else, then maybe he's talking about vanilla ice. I mean,
could be.
I mean, it said he had a sword. Well, he says slice like a ninja, cut like a razor blade. It could be him, and I didn't even have to change that, So, actually, little factoid, a few years ago, as an exercise, I managed to, and I can't find it, I have to dig for it harder. I recreated, I found the complete lyrics of Ice Ice Baby in the Bible.
Oh, very good.
I invented my own Bible code to show that the Bible predicts Ice Ice Baby.
Sure. Well, the nature of fan fiction is that you can interpret it in a myriad of different ways, and nonsensical ways, for that matter.
Yes. It doesn't need to make sense. This is religion. Right.
So the Book of Epistles.
Yeah. So last book of Enoch, the Epistles, or the Book of Blessings and Curses, which I think Blessings and Curses is actually a better fit, just because of its contents. But
yeah,
essentially, Enoch is like, so blessed are all the cool people who do all kind of cool stuff and who are righteous and worship correctly, who have the correct theology. And damn all the others. And it's like, here are all the good things that you can look forward to if you're doing everything right. And if you're doing wrong, basically, if you do not agree with us, if you're the people we don't like,
Yeah.
Here's what you got coming. And it's got a lot of very interesting things to say about the good people and the bad. There's a lot of martyr theology woven in there. Like, look, if you're good, you're going to have a crap life. But that tells you that you're probably on the right side. So just persevere, get through it, because you have this great reward awaiting in heaven. And if you are like rich, if you are wealthy, if you are powerful, if you rule over other people, you're going to burn. You're going to suffer. It's going to be horrible. And it gets extremely graphic. There's like rivers of blood, you know. They're going to sit there and just like gloat over the fate of the people who disagreed with them as they just suffer this horrible torment. And something I like, it kind of has some stuff similar to the Beatitudes, which is found in the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. You know, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, or whatever. Blessed are this, blessed are that. But something I bumped into accidentally while covering the writings of Paul in my last episode about the end of the letter to the Romans is that the format of the Sermon on the Mount, where it starts off with this whole, you know, blessing of this and yada yada yada, and then it goes on and it concludes with this this warning against people who want to judge other people.
Interesting.
I found that exact format not only in Paul's letter to the Romans, but in the 5th section of the first book of Enoch. And so, like, not just a couple little phrases that were similar, but the order, the format.
Yeah.
And I can't find it in anything older than Enoch. And so I kind of have to wonder, did this section right here, because we know the gospel authors, they loved quoting Paul. Okay. Half of what Jesus says came from Paul. So I have to wonder, is Paul referencing the epistles of Enoch here? Is he talking about the blessings and curses in his letter to the Romans? And then that gets picked up by Matthew. So I'm going to be doing some work on this in the near future. But there's a chance that the Sermon on the Mount has its origins in the Book of Enoch. And I'm working on a piece that'll probably be about 20 or 30 minutes long that just goes deep into this one topic. So
before we talk about the relationship of the Book of Enoch and Christianity, which I definitely want to talk about, what does the Book of Enoch, and this is really a lot of meat and potatoes, like this is the last half an hour is really just setting the table. Now we get to talk about what the hell is going on within Judaism and calendars. Do you want to talk about that, sir? And what the importance is of calendars? Because I think the calendars pretty important.
Like I said, this is the thing that people ignore because it seems boring. But there's a section in Enoch where they devote this massive portion to talking about a solar calendar. Now, as most people know, the Jews used a lunar calendar. Everything is based on the cycles of the moon, okay? And their days begin at sunset, which is weird. A lot of people in the ancient world, the day began at sunrise, okay? In Judaism, the day ends at sunset and then the new day begins then, okay? And so you fast. If you're fasting for a day, you fast beginning at sunset until sunset the following day, okay? And this because the whole thing is centered around this lunar calendar. Now, if you use a lunar calendar, you have a problem. The moon doesn't cycle through in, you know, an even amount of times each year, okay? So if you use a lunar calendar, your calendar gets off by about 10 or 11 days a year.
And that's a lot.
Right. And especially if you compound this over time. If you do this in just 3 years, you are now off by an entire month. And what you now have to do is either add in extra weeks to your calendar or an extra month every so many years, or your calendar just keeps getting off further and further and further. And if this happens, you won't have your sacrifices, your rituals in the correct times. And a perfect example of this is look at how Easter is calculated. Okay, the Roman Catholic Church is the ones who decide when Easter is every year. Though we actually don't need them to do it. We can calculate it. You look at the first Sunday following the first full moon following the spring equinox. Okay, well, that's paganism right there. I'm sorry. That's, go to Stonehenge and dance naked around a bonfire, whatever. Now, why would something like that be important? Why would you have some kind of theological division over this? We know from ancient Greek sources that the Israelites, before the Babylonian exile, were excellent astronomers.
Say that again, because a lot of people don't know that.
We know from Greek sources that before the Babylonian exile, this is 586 BCE, the Israelites were great astronomers. Now, if you look at the Old Testament, you would have no indication of this. Actually, you would think the opposite, because they seem to have an aversion to the movements of the stars. They don't like them. That's astrology, and that's a sin. Okay? They'll kill you for that. They will straight hit you with rocks until you're dead for doing stuff like that. But then we get into the New Testament, and we have these magic guys who are led by signs in the sky that tell them that a Messiah will be born, and it leads them straight to the town where Jesus is. That's astrology. That doesn't fit with the Old Testament. You look at the Book of Enoch, especially the third section, the Book of Astronomy, and it begins by telling you essentially how to build a solar calendar. And this essentially tells you how to put markings on sort of like a horizontal surface. And you watch it every single morning or every afternoon, whichever one you can be awake for. You see where the sun rises or sets, and you put a mark. And as the year progresses, the sun moves further north or south, in the eastern sky. Okay, it doesn't rise and set in the same place every day. It looks like it, but over time it moves. And they've divided it up into little groups, and then divided those groups into smaller groups. And this is a complex solar calendar. Now, it'd be time-consuming and expensive to build one, so most places didn't have them. But large places, like, say, Jerusalem, would. You would have a primitive observatory with a place where you would stand or sit, and a place where you would look that would be about eye level facing the horizon, and you would have these markings on there. And this way, you didn't need to sit there and keep tally marks of everything, okay? And so when the sun comes up, you're like, I wonder what day it is. You just got to wake up before the sun, go out there, and when the sun comes up, wherever it comes up along that little line, you have a marking that tells you what day it is. And so now it doesn't matter what the weather's doing. You know when to plant your crops, when to harvest, when to start storing up for the winter. You know all this stuff. You know what's going to happen before it happens.
I'm going to ask you a stupid question. What are the advantages of the solar calendar over the lunar calendar?
At most, you'll be off by one day every 4 years, as opposed to a week and a half every year. So that would be one thing. And if other people, especially people around you, are operating off of this poorly conceived lunar calendar, there's something else you can do. You can show your power over them by predicting things that they can't accurately predict, because they could be off anywhere from, 10 to 30 days in a given year. You can predict exactly when a star will appear in the sky. If you've been tracking this for a long period of time, you can predict when there will be a solar or lunar eclipse down to the day. The Mayans used to do this. We thought they were had involvement with aliens. No, they just watched the sky for a long enough period of time to realize this stuff was cyclical. And if you're sun worshipers and you base this on a solar calendar, not a lunar, you can predict down to the day when celestial events will occur. This is how Easter Island got its name. They showed up and they're like, oh, watch, we're going to show these people. They're like, hey, look, tomorrow there's going to be an eclipse. And then it happened. And the people were like, oh, they're like, look, we will make the sun go dark. And they thought that they did it. No, they just predicted it because they had a chart, you know? This is power, you know, in a time of vast ignorance. The most knowledgeable people were like your Persian magi. It was the people who looked at the sky. And this was used widely by kings because, oh, look, our king is a symbol of the fertility of the world, of nature, of the nation. And there would be these festivals, and all these ancient cultures, especially those that had a complex calendar, used these things. The Babylonians had one called Zagmuk. Go back to my Christmas episode about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, and you'll find this. And this thing, what was done, and this also happened in other cultures, you know, like the Scandinavians did this, okay? The wild man of the woods, you know, Odin, all that. And what was done is the king would basically pretend to die and then resurrect. And this would coincide with that shift in the sun as it begins moving north again, because at this point you have 3 days when the sun is at its lowest point on the horizon. And this is in the dead of winter. This your winter solstice. Everything seems darkest. The nights are the longest. You know, it's bleak. Will the light come back, or will it continue to get darker and darker until we all die? And then the king triumphantly rises from the dead in this weird sort of resurrection play. And this would coincide with the movement of it. And it wasn't like, oh, well, the king is coming back at the same time as the sun. It was seen as the king is bringing back the sun. This is power. This is political power on a level we cannot comprehend. Imagine if your leader had the power to move the sun. This is the type of power these people wielded because they had a calendar that was essentially infallible. And it would appear they could predict things that no human could predict because they saw a pattern.
Would it be safe to say that the people represented, or the sect in the Book of Enoch, are the losers in the calendar wars?
Yes. The Jews that were taken away to Babylon in 586 BC after Jerusalem was essentially destroyed, they were heavily influenced by the Babylonian ideology. And when they came back about 50 years later, they brought with them a variety of new ideas, including a lunar calendar. And you can see remnants of this conflict in places like the Book of Isaiah, where they actually call these people like impure, unclean, apostates. They say that the New Jerusalem temple, which was built by the Persians, they call it a harlot on a hilltop. That there was some conflict. They did not like this. They actually say that some of the people coming back weren't even Jews, which I think there may be something to that. I go into that in an episode sometime after my Zoroastrianism episode. I don't remember exactly when, but I go deeper into that. There could be evidence that not all the people who came back were Jewish exiles, but were just people from all over, which was actually pretty common. And when this happened, the people who were in power were essentially put in power by the Persians. The Persians had just defeated Babylon, and so everything that belonged to Babylon now belonged to Cyrus the Great of Persia, including the kingdom of Judah. Now, you can't be a king if you're under Cyrus, because Cyrus is the king of kings. So what happens? He takes a man, this Babylonian lackey named Zerubbabel, and he puts him in charge of Judah. He becomes the governor of Judah. And this is where King David comes in. He kind of appears for the first time in the archaeological record as a ancestor of Zerubbabel. Why David has a descendant who's from Babylon, but this is his claim to power, is that he's descended from this legendary king that we have no evidence for before the exile. And he comes in and he basically rules, or governs the place for Cyrus, so he can go off and conquer Egypt and everywhere else he wants to go. And when this happens, Cyrus builds them a new temple and tells them, hey, this is actually the land you were originally from, because y'all have been gone for generations, sometimes longer, depending on who it was. Y'all are going to settle here. This is actually your land. You're these great people. You're descended from like God's chosen people. And I'm going to build you a temple, and it's going to be freaking sweet. And so Persia, this Persian emperor, builds the Jerusalem temple.
Right.
That's weird. And we actually have references in the book of 4th Ezra that Persia is where the Old Testament came from. It actually says that Ezra drank a magic potion, just like Zarathustra, communed with God on a mountain, just like Zarathustra, and then wrote down the scriptures, just like Zarathustra, and then brought it to this holy city, just like Zarathustra or Moses. And all of a sudden, there's this drastic shift in theology.
Yeah.
And their calendar. They're now operating on the Babylonian lunar calendar, and the locals don't like it. And the reason they don't like it is because their festivals, their rituals, are now falling on the wrong days, because if you're not keeping track of the calendar properly, then you're losing days every year. And one of the things that you'll notice is when you're counting your days according to your months, which used to be based on where the sun rose on this little mechanism, but is now based on how many times the moon has changed its brightness, your calendar is going to be off. And the way that you would double check your calendar is by looking at the constellations. People have been doing this for thousands of years. This is astrology. Okay. And if your constellations are appearing in the wrong month, you screwed up somewhere. You got to go back and double check your work.
Yeah. I think it's important for people who are watching and listening to realize what an existential threat it was for the old guard there to have their festivals and feast days on just on the wrong date, because a lot of these festivals are meant to renew the world or to keep things going.
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't just, hey, it's party time, let's all get drunk and have an orgy. I mean, they did that too. That was part of it. But what they believed, and this was pretty much true of all ancient cultures, what you believed was that what happened on Earth was a reenactment of the things that were going on up in the heavens. Okay. And they had these things, these different plays that were conducted by high priests and priestesses and kings, sometimes criminals. And it was this theatrical reenactment of myths that were directly connected with the creation of the universe and the renewal of nature. Zagmuk from Babylon is a perfect example of that. The Christian Passion Play is another perfect example. And they're not too dissimilar from one another. Check my Christmas episode for that. So these things, it wasn't just a festival. They believed that by doing these things, by reenacting the combat between Yahweh and Leviathan, or Marduk and Tiamat, they were not only, refreshing their memory as to what had happened at the beginning of time, but they were bringing back the light. They were physically restoring the universe to its proper order, to bring an end to the darkness, bring an end to the winter, to make the rains come again, to make the crops grow, to bring in the harvest so that they could survive, because they couldn't just, run down to Food Lion and grab a can of beans. Okay. You grew it or you died.
Yeah.
And this was dependent on sun and rain. And these things are intrinsically linked with their deities that are central in these festivals. And these festivals are linked with the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars.
Yeah.
They happened in the heavens at a certain time, and that renewed the heavens. But if you wanted to renew the earth, you had to conduct your festivals in time with the events in the heavens.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's another thing with apocalyptic literature. You don't think of heaven and earth as two different things. The earth is essentially a shadow of the events in the heavens. They are one thing.
Mm.
Kings are angels, and angels are stars. There's no difference between a king and a star and an angel. Look at the nativity scene. Jesus, he is seen as a star. He is a god. He is a king, a star, a god. It's one thing. It's not three separate things. My girlfriend still gets headaches when I try to explain this to her. Don't think of them as three different things. They are not. They are one thing. And it's important to understand that.
So this is an interesting place to pivot on to, in your opinion, modern day Christianity. Does it have more to do with the Book of Enoch or about what we consider to be Orthodox Judaism or what we see in the Old Testament?
For this, instead of just giving my opinion, let me throw out some numbers. So we all know that the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. The number one source in the Old Testament that is quoted by the New Testament is the book of Isaiah. And depending on how you count, somewhere between 35 and 50 times. Now, some of those quotes, such as one of them that is quoted by Paul in his letter to the Romans, could also be a quote of a section in Enoch. It actually fits better because the passage in Enoch contains terms that are used in Paul, but are not found in the same passage in Isaiah. Now, Isaiah, parts of it don't really fit well with the Old Testament. It kind of has a different theology. Parts of its theology more closely match Enoch than the rest of the Old Testament. So Isaiah may not really be that orthodox, or at least parts of it aren't. Isaiah actually has three different sections that were written by three completely different people, maybe at three different times. And at least one part of that fits really well with Enoch, but not with the Torah. Now, if you get rid of the section of Isaiah that is similar to Enoch, all of a sudden your quotes from Isaiah in the New Testament, they drop drastically down to around a dozen or so.
Interesting.
So that, okay, cool. But let's take the full 50, which is drastically more than any other book in the Old Testament, more than many others combined even. The first book of Enoch is quoted by the New Testament over 65 times that I've found so far.
Mm-hmm.
I just discovered 3 more 2 weeks ago. So we may be looking at closer to 70 instead of 60s, which is still a lot more than 50, which is way more than a dozen. But no matter how you look at it, no matter how you count it, the New Testament quotes Enoch more than any book of the Old Testament. Period. That you can quantify this. That's just a simple fact. But then when you start looking at the theology, the New Testament is messianic. The Old Testament is not. The New Testament is apocalyptic. With the exception of Ezekiel, which is talking about the fall of Israel to the Babylonians, or the book of Daniel, which doesn't even belong in the Old Testament. It fits quite well with the New Testament and with Enoch. But with those two exceptions, the Old Testament is not apocalyptic. Enoch is nothing but apocalyptic. Where in the Old Testament, where does corruption, where does evil come from? Well, if you read Isaiah 45:7, it comes from Yahweh. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things. One God creates all of it. If you read Deuteronomy, it comes from reneging on a land deal.
Yeah.
Oh, Yahweh says if we do these things, then we get this land. Oh, but we didn't. Therefore, we are punished for evil. Okay. If you read the book of Judges, it comes from worshiping other gods. Every different story you read, there's a different origin for evil. If you read the New Testament, evil comes from evil spirits. It comes from the archons, the powers, the dominions, the rulers of this world who were working against the great high God. Well, that's also where the evil comes from in Enoch. If you want to find out how everything will be fixed, well, if you just obey the Torah, well, the Old Testament says then it'll be all right. Well, in the New Testament, it's like, no. It needs to be purified. The world is corrupt on a fundamental level. Creation itself is ruined, and we need blood to fix it. So how it gets fixed, Enoch and the New Testament have that in common as well. These aren't just little details. These are the fundamental defining characteristics of Christianity. Gentiles, is this religion for the Jews only, for the descendants of Abraham? Or is it for the whole world? Is it for the Gentiles? Christianity says, well, yes. The Old Testament doesn't. The Old Testament says the Jews are first. Everyone else is corrupt. They're evil. They should be killed or enslaved. Well, what does Enoch say? Enoch says to give this message to the Gentiles. This is anti-Torah. And frequently, scholars for centuries have been since 200 BC. Actually, earlier than that, back in the letters of Paul, people are trying to reconcile Christianity with the Old Testament. How do you fit this theology with the Hebrew Bible? It's been a problem for 2,000 years. Why does Christianity contradict the Jewish scriptures to such a great degree? It only contradicts the Jewish scriptures to a great degree if you are ignoring a large volume of Jewish scriptures.
Right.
Like the Book of Enoch. Once you include things like the Book of Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah, you don't have a contradiction. It fits perfectly. And I don't think you can properly understand early Christianity unless you understand the Book of Enoch, which is referenced more than any other book in the Old Testament. It is quoted so many times. Its theology fits better. And there's a great book all about that. It is called, actually, there are two great books all about that. The first one, Temple Theology by Margaret Barker. She has been researching the origins of Christianity for over 40 years. She's holds a PhD, I believe, in New Testament studies. She teaches New Testament studies, I believe, at Cambridge. She's also a Methodist minister. She is brilliant. I think her brain must be in a jar somewhere because there's no way it fits inside of her head. That it just doesn't. But there's another book that she has called The Lost Prophet. This is all about Enoch and its influence on early Christianity. And these two books combined will give you a fresh look. I'm not saying that you need to throw out the Old Testament, but I think we need to include more than just the Old Testament. And I have like 6 or 7 episodes on my podcast that cover the Book of Enoch that kind of tells you why we should include it.
Yeah, definitely. I recommend that to anyone who's watching and listening. Go over Dragons and Genesis, check out the episodes on the Book of Enoch, and wow, it'll turn your head around. There are things you didn't know. And if you're intellectually curious, I think that you'll find those very satisfying episodes indeed.
Yeah. And the Book of Enoch is a lot more exciting than the Bible. I think it's episodes 48 to 54. They all reference song titles, so it'll be easy to find.
Right. So, dude, we're coming down to the a little bit over an hour, but was there a question you wanted me to ask you, but I didn't? Was there a topic? Because we covered a lot. It was a very ambitious hour. Was there something that you really wanted me to ask you? And this isn't about plugs or where people can find you online. We'll do that later. Was there something you wanted me to ask you, but I didn't?
I don't know. When it comes to the topic of Enoch, we could do a 24-hour live stream, and I wouldn't stop talking the entire time. So no, I think we covered the basics, and we dug in deeper on this. So I think this was a good introduction to Enoch. So anyone who wants to know about it, it's exciting. It's way more fun than the Bible. There's angel sex in it. It's great, people.
So before Jason and I were talking, before we went live, Jason was telling me this funny story about his last name, Foux. Jason, you want to retell that story for everybody?
Sure. So my last name is spelled Foux. And if you looked at that, you would think it was French. And since I'm from Louisiana, you would, be more compelled to think it was French. But it's not pronounced faux. It's pronounced Foux. And the reason is because my grandfather didn't really like the French too much. So my great-grandfather was the last one to bear the original spelling. That's the old Germanic spelling of Fux. So my name should have been Jason Foux. I'm not sure that's the pronunciation, but considering my grandfather changed it to avoid the pronunciation, I think it was. Anyway, it got changed from Foux to Foux to sort of appear Cajun, even though it was a German name. But he didn't like the French because he had to go fight in World War II. And he's, according to his words, if the French had just fought back, he wouldn't have had to sign up at the age of 16 to prevent them from speaking German. He was a great guy. He was crazy. So he changed it to look Cajun because when you're in Louisiana, everyone's name ends in OUX. But he changed the pronunciation to Foux because he didn't want it to sound French. And so I am now stuck with this last name that no one can pronounce. It looks French, but you pronounce the X, and it's all weird. All because of my crazy grandfather.
That's great, dude. That is a great story, I have to tell you. One last question. Oh, by the way, people in the chat think that you're wonderful because you are. Ian Davenport says a great show, Andy, the best guest. And you have a great podcast, which you do.
And Ian Davenport, thank you very much for your support. I was about to send you a message about that, so thank you very much.
I Am Charioteer asks, what do you think of Eric von Danigan?
Oh, Eric von Danigan. I love him in the same way I love Ken Ham. He has these amazing ideas. There's a podcast called The Unexplained with the host is a man named Howard Hughes, not the original Howard Hughes, but a different one. And it's sort of like Coast to Coast with Art Bell. And though I think Howard Hughes is a much better host. Anyway, he interviews the Eric von Danigan, who is the major proponent for the ancient aliens theory, that the pyramids and everything else, it was built by aliens. If you go back to the Unexplained podcast, episode 190, I believe, and I can only remember that because I have a strange way of remembering numbers. He is interviewed on there. Now, he's interviewed twice. It's the older episode. I think it's 190. I think got interviewed again in like the 220s or something. But in episode 190, Eric von Danigan is interviewed by Howard Hughes. And in there, he actually says how he came up with the idea that aliens basically did everything. He was a student at a Catholic school in like Sweden or Switzerland or somewhere in Europe. And while there, he was basically failing theology. He was also failing history. And he wanted some way to kind of make sense of both of them. So what he did was he made up a story that explained away the contradictions. Instead of just accepting, okay, here's history and your religion doesn't match up. He said, what if I make up a way? And he says this in the podcast. What if I come up with a way that history and religion doesn't contradict one another? Aliens. He says this in the podcast. He didn't understand history. He didn't understand religion. He was failing both of those classes. So he invented aliens to fix his bad grades.
It's like the god of the gaps instead of the alien of the gaps. That's crazy.
We have people with crazy hair on the History Channel talking about it like it's real. I mean, look, I failed algebra. I had to retake it in summer school. What if I said, you know what? Algebra wasn't invented by the Arabs. Atlantis did it. And then I get a show on the History Channel to explain math to people. I'm not the guy to explain math. I failed algebra. You don't ask me math problems. I'll be like, I don't know. Ask your phone. You know? No. The History Channel should get me on there. I'll go and explain some shit to you. Yeah. Algebra came from Atlantis. Yeah. That's Eric von Daniken. The guy's still alive, by the way, and still making money off of books talking about how like aliens built stuff out of rocks. So
crazy.
Yeah.
Jason Foux, I gotta say thank you for coming on my YouTube channel and talking about the Book of Enoch. Once again, very entertaining. Learn some more stuff. Where can people find you online, sir?
You can go to facebook.com/Dragons and Genesis. There's like a little tagged post in there where you can support me. It has like Amazon wish list and stuff full of books. I don't really need any right now because I've got a giant to be read pile. You can also find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Dragons and Genesis. Or you can go to dragonsandgenesis.com. That's my website. It's got links to everything. It has a big list of recommended reading, all kinds of good stuff. YouTube.com/Dragons and Genesis podcast. That's where I answer questions that people send me. I also take old episodes of the podcast, slap a clip art on them, and toss them up there so people can listen to them, because some people don't like listening to podcasts for some reason. But for podcasts, this is my real home. This is where everything happens first. Get on any podcast app. Doesn't matter what it is. Download a podcast app on your phone. Your phone probably already has one. And do a search for Dragons in Genesis. Big orange logo with Godzilla attacking Jerusalem. You can't miss it.
Best logo ever. Everyone in the chat, everyone who's watching, listening, thank you very much. Jason, you can come on the show, come on my channel anytime, and we'll talk whatever you want to talk about, because it is always fun, always entertaining, and I learn stuff.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast. I love talking about this stuff. And if you want to hear me prattle on more, Monday, I'm going to be on the Daily Atheist Morning Show talking about the idea that the Romans invented Jesus and wrote the New Testament. So if you've heard anything about that and you want to get the inside scoop, what's that all about? Is it a legitimate hypothesis or whatever? I'm going to be talking about all of that. So go and check that out Monday, 9 a.m. Eastern on The Damn Show.
Fantastic. Well, take care, everyone. Thanks again. Be strong.
Thank you for having me.